I'm truly overwhelmed by the love and support from each of you watching today. You're not just viewers, you're the heart of this channel, and every like, share, and subscribe lights up this journey. From all corners of America and the rest of the world, your kindness and belief inspire me to keep telling these stories. You too can still make your impact count. It's never too late to step that great step. Please join our family by subscribing and sharing. We're stronger together, and I'm so grateful to have you here. Now, let's start with today's powerful story. Love in the Shadows, a haunted night that changed everything. Caroline pressed her back against the cold marble tomb, clutching her sketchbook as if it could protect her. The gate behind them had slammed shut minutes ago, locking her and Daniel inside Lafayette Cemetery No. 1. The air had grown colder, so cold she could see her breath. Around them, the graves seemed to whisper. Shapes shifted between the tombs, moving closer each time they blinked. Daniel's flashlight flickered. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. A soft cry floated through the night, a woman's weeping, distant at first, then closer, echoing through the narrow paths of the dead. The voice belonged to someone who, according to legend, had been buried here over a century ago. Caroline reached for Daniel's hand, her heart pounding. Every instinct screamed to run, but something inside her said to stay. She didn't know that this terrifying night would become the most unforgettable one of their lives, one that would teach them that love often finds us in the darkest places, and real courage means facing the fear together. Have you ever been so afraid that running seemed like the only option, but something told you to stay? Tell us where you're watching from, subscribe for more true stories, and don't miss tomorrow's episode. Please, come with us to the very beginning. Caroline adjusted her sketchbook on her lap, her pencil moving in quick, confident strokes. She sat near the corner of Jackson Square, surrounded by the hum of street performers, artists, and tourists drifting between the cafes and the St. Louis Cathedral. The sound of a saxophone carried through the warm afternoon air, blending with laughter and conversation. Her sketches were mostly of people, moments in motion, faces caught between joy and thought. For her, every trip was a chance to find something worth remembering, something she could draw and hold on to. At 28, Caroline had built a quiet life for herself in Portland, Oregon, working as a freelance illustrator. Her days were spent creating children's book drawings and commissions, but lately she'd been craving more than deadlines and digital screens. New Orleans had always fascinated her, its mix of beauty and melancholy. She came for inspiration, not adventure, but life rarely asks for permission before becoming both. Daniel, meanwhile, stood across town, looking up at a row of magnolia trees lining Prytania Street. He carried a guidebook in one hand and a small camera in the other. At 31, he was a high school history teacher from Boston who hadn't taken a vacation in 3 years. His students often joked that he loved the past more than people. Maybe they were right. He was drawn to old cities, places that remembered things long forgotten. New Orleans had called to him, not for its music or food, but for its stories. He had spent the day tracing the city's history, from the French Quarter to the Garden District. The late afternoon sun filtered through the iron balconies and sprawling oaks, throwing shifting patterns of light across the old sidewalks. He stopped in front of one of the grand antebellum mansions on Prytania Street. Its walls were faded, the paint peeling in places, but the design still carried dignity. History was alive here. It breathed through the cracks, whispered through the streets. Caroline had found her way to the same district, sketchbook still in hand. The further she walked, the quieter the world became. The chatter of tourists faded behind her, replaced by the slow hum of cicadas. Her steps slowed as she passed old houses lined with jasmine and ivy, their shutters half open like eyes that had seen too much. She'd planned to return to her hotel before dark, but something about the stillness drew her onward. At the corner of Washington Avenue, she noticed an old sign, Lafayette Cemetery No. 1. The gate was partly open, as if waiting for someone to enter. She hesitated. The place looked like it hadn't changed in 100 years. Rows of above-ground tombs, marble and stone weathered by time. Curiosity tugged at her. She thought she'd take a few quick sketches, maybe catch the play of light before sunset. She stepped inside. A few blocks away, Daniel was finishing his walk when he saw the same entrance. The gate seemed to lean toward him, an open invitation. He'd read about this place before, one of the oldest cemeteries in the city, dating back to the early 1800s. He told himself he'd only stay for a few minutes. The sun was already dipping behind the rooftops, the sky fading to a dusky orange. He wanted one last photo before the light disappeared. Caroline wandered deeper, her footsteps soft on the cracked stone path. She noticed the way moss crept up the sides of tombs, the way some names had been erased by time. The air felt different here, still, almost waiting. She paused near a broken monument, tracing her fingers over the carved date, 1853. Her pencil hovered over her sketchbook. The composition was perfect. She began to draw. Daniel moved along another path, camera in hand, fascinated by the craftsmanship of the tombs. Many were family crypts, stacked like miniature houses, each with its own story sealed inside. He caught the faint scent of decaying flowers and damp stone. The sound of his own footsteps echoed back at him. He stopped, realizing he hadn't seen another person since he entered. For some reason, that didn't bother him, yet. Caroline looked up from her sketch when she heard the faint click of a camera somewhere nearby. The sound came from deeper in the maze of tombs. She assumed it was another tourist, maybe someone like her, trying to capture the last light of the day. She smiled faintly and went back to her drawing. Daniel checked his watch, 6:47 p.m. He figured he'd head out before it got dark. As he turned toward the entrance, he noticed the gate behind him, just visible through the rows of tombs. It stood open, still as before. He took one last photo and turned back to the path. The air felt cooler now, brushing lightly against his neck. Caroline gathered her things, ready to leave, when a sudden gust moved through the cemetery. The gate creaked faintly in the distance. She frowned, unsure if she'd imagined it. A chill ran through her, though the day had been warm. Daniel stopped walking. He couldn't explain why, but something made him turn back. The gate, still visible through the narrow passageways, seemed to shift, just slightly. It stood ajar no longer. Two strangers, drawn by curiosity, had stepped into a place that belonged to the past. They didn't yet know that the same whisper of history had called them both. The same unseen force had waited, patient and silent, for years. Before the sun disappeared completely, the gate behind them began to move. The heavy iron gate groaned and swung shut with a final, echoing clang. Caroline froze, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. The sound reverberated through the narrow pathways, fading into the still air. She turned toward the entrance, half expecting to see someone there, maybe a caretaker closing up for the evening. But the walkway beyond the gate was empty. Twilight had fallen quietly over Lafayette Cemetery No. 1, wrapping the place in fading gold. Built in 1833, its tombs stood shoulder to shoulder like rows of silent witnesses. Each one was different, some polished and proud, others cracked and crumbling, covered in creeping ivy. The names and dates etched into marble told stories of lives long past, some spanning generations. The air smelled faintly of dust and wet stone, the way old books do when opened after years of silence. Caroline walked slowly, her footsteps echoing in the narrow aisles. She tugged her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, the temperature dropping with every breath. This wasn't the usual New Orleans evening warmth. It was a cold that felt misplaced, almost unnatural. Her fingers stiffened around the pencil she still held, though she had stopped drawing long ago. A faint sound drifted through the tombs. At first, she thought it was the wind moving through the cracks, but no breeze followed. The noise came again, a low, broken sob, distant yet clear enough to raise the hair on her arms. It was weeping. Soft. Human. Caroline's heart pounded. She looked around, expecting to see someone, maybe another visitor caught like her. "Hello," she called softly. Her voice carried farther than she expected, bouncing off the stone walls. No answer. Only another small cry, deeper in the maze of graves. Her rational mind urged her to turn back. The smart thing would be to wait by the gate, maybe call for help. But something about that sound stopped her. It wasn't threatening. It was sorrowful. It drew her forward step by step, like a thread she couldn't let go of. Elsewhere in the cemetery, Daniel had just noticed the silence. He turned and found the gate closed tight behind him. He reached it within seconds, gripping the iron bars, but they didn't move. He pushed harder, but the hinges held fast. "Hey!" he shouted, hoping someone outside would hear him. His voice echoed, but no one answered. The last of the daylight faded, and with it went the sense of time. Daniel pulled out his phone, but the screen flickered and went black before he could turn on the flashlight. A shiver ran through him. He looked around. The cemetery stretched in every direction, each path nearly identical. The tombs seemed to lean in closer now, their marble faces catching the faintest traces of moonlight. Caroline kept walking toward the sound. The air grew heavier, pressing down with every step. Her breath came out in short clouds. She reached a narrow passage lined with family tombs. The weeping grew louder here, coming from somewhere beyond the next corner. She hesitated, then moved closer. Daniel chose the opposite direction, moving deeper in search of another exit. The more he walked, the more disoriented he felt. The layout didn't make sense anymore. Paths that should have led out seemed to curve back into the same center. The shadows from the tombs stretched longer than they should, even without clear light to cast them. He stopped, staring at one that moved across the wall, slowly, deliberately, though he was standing perfectly still. The soundscape changed. Whispers began to join the weeping. Faint at first, like voices carried on the wind. Words too quiet to understand, yet close enough to feel. They brushed past Daniel's ear, soft and cold. He turned sharply, his flashlight flickering once more before dying completely. Caroline heard them too. She froze, eyes darting around the narrow space. The whispers came from every direction, overlapping, rising, and falling in rhythm with the weeping. She pressed her back against a tomb, her pulse quickening. The air had turned icy, far colder than the October night should allow. Her phone's light barely pierced the darkness. She aimed it down the path, catching a flicker of movement, something shifting just beyond view. A shape, faint and formless, sliding between the tombs. She blinked hard. Nothing. Just darkness. But when she turned the light back, it was closer. Daniel stumbled into another passageway, trying to keep calm. "It's just my mind," he muttered under his breath. "It's the dark playing tricks." But even as he said it, a cold breath grazed the back of his neck. He spun around. Nothing there. Only shadows. And yet, one of them seemed to lean forward as if watching him. Caroline's instincts screamed to run. Every logical thought told her to find the gate again, to scream for help. Yet her feet refused to move. The sorrow in the air pulled her deeper. The crying was louder now, more desperate. "Hello," she tried again. Her voice trembled. "Do you need help?" The sound stopped. For one breathless moment, the entire cemetery went silent. No wind. No whisper. Only her own heartbeat thudding in her ears. Then, faintly, from somewhere close behind her, a single whisper answered, too faint to catch, but it was there. Daniel turned another corner and froze. In the faint moonlight, he thought he saw someone, a woman, maybe, standing at the far end of the path. She wasn't moving, just standing, half hidden behind a tomb. He opened his mouth to call out, but when he blinked, she was gone. The weeping started again, this time surrounding them both, though they were still unaware of each other's presence. The voices twisted through the cold air, carrying words neither could understand. The shadows along the tomb walls began to move again, not flickering like tricks of light, but sliding, shifting, alive. By now, both Caroline and Daniel knew something was wrong. The city lights beyond the cemetery had vanished, swallowed by the dark. Every step they took echoed too loud, too hollow. The air smelled of damp stone and time. Each of them was lost in the same maze, following sounds they couldn't explain. Two strangers, alone among the dead, each feeling, in the quiet between heartbeats, that they were not alone at all. Caroline turned sharply around a corner, her flashlight trembling in her grip. At the exact same moment, Daniel rounded the opposite side of the tomb. They collided hard enough for her sketchbook to fall from her hands. She gasped and stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. For a split second, her mind screamed that it was another shadow, but then she saw his face, wide-eyed and human. "Oh my God," she exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest. "You're real." Daniel steadied himself, nodding. "Yeah. You too. I thought I was the only one stuck in here." They both stood still, breathing heavily, trying to calm the panic that had been rising inside them for the last half hour. The relief of seeing another living person almost made Caroline laugh. Almost. The tension between them softened into something fragile but grounding. "Did you hear it too?" she asked quietly. Daniel nodded slowly. "The crying?" "Yeah. I heard it from somewhere near the middle. I tried to leave, but the gate won't open. It's like it's sealed shut." Caroline bent down to pick up her sketchbook, hands shaking. "I was about to leave before I heard her. It sounded like someone was hurt. I couldn't just walk away." Daniel's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "You followed it?" She gave a small, uncertain nod. "I thought maybe someone needed help." For a moment, silence settled between them. The air felt thicker now, heavier. The ground seemed to hum faintly beneath their feet. Caroline looked around at the surrounding tombs, tall, cold, unmoving, but the shadows between them were restless, sliding slowly across the marble as if responding to their words. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. Daniel's reply came barely above a breath. "It's like the place is listening." The temperature dropped again, sharper this time. Their breaths turned to mist. Suddenly, the faint whispers they had both been hearing grew louder, overlapping, echoing from every direction. Dozens of voices, pleading, angry, sorrowful, all tangled together into a wave of sound. Caroline flinched and covered her ears, the noise cutting through her like glass. Daniel grabbed her arm. "We need to go," he said urgently. "We can't stay here." But as he pulled, the air around them shifted violently. A burst of wind rushed through the narrow space, scattering dried leaves and dust. The flashlight flickered wildly, throwing jagged shapes across the walls. The shadows around them began to gather, slowly forming into shapes that resembled people, outlines flickering in and out of focus. Caroline froze in place, her pulse hammering. Daniel instinctively stepped in front of her, though he didn't know what he was protecting her from. The dark figures circled them, silent now, their presence pressing in from all sides. "Run," Daniel said under his breath. "We can still find a way out." Caroline shook her head. Her voice was quiet but firm. "No." He turned to her, incredulous. "No? Are you serious? Look around you." But she didn't look at him. She was watching the shadows. They didn't move closer. They just hovered, waiting, as if expecting something. She could feel their grief, thick and desperate, like the echo of a cry that never stopped. She closed her eyes. They're not trying to hurt us. Daniel stared at her, completely thrown. What are you talking about? Listen, she said softly. Don't just hear the sound. Listen. The noise surged again, a chorus of whispers swirling around them, but beneath it all was something different, something aching and human. Caroline's breathing slowed. She ignored the cold, ignored the fear crawling up her spine. She let the sound in. In that moment, she felt it, a pull, not outward, but inward. The sorrow was not meant to scare. It was reaching out, begging to be understood. Her throat tightened as she realized that whatever haunted this place wasn't evil. It was pain that had never been heard. Daniel was still frozen, his eyes darting between the moving shapes. Caroline, this isn't safe, he warned, though his voice had lost its certainty. She took a step forward. I hear you, she said aloud, her voice trembling but clear. I don't know what you need, but I hear your pain. I'm listening. The effect was immediate. Every whisper stopped. The air stilled. Even the flickering flashlight seemed to steady, the beam freezing on a single tomb ahead of them. The silence was so complete that Daniel could hear the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. He looked at her, standing motionless, her eyes open now, face lit softly by the beam. She wasn't afraid anymore. There was something peaceful about her expression, as if she finally understood what the place wanted. Daniel lowered his arm slowly. What did you just do? Caroline didn't answer right away. She felt the stillness pressing in around them, but it no longer felt hostile. The air had changed, not warmer, but lighter, like a weight lifting. The shapes around them no longer advanced. They simply lingered, fading in and out of visibility. He took a slow step toward her, his fear giving way to something else, wonder. You calmed them, he whispered. Caroline turned to him, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of the flashlight. I think they just wanted someone to acknowledge them. Daniel looked around. All this time, and no one listened. The silence stretched on for a few moments. Then, softly, one of the shadows shifted closer, stopping at the edge of the light. It didn't move like smoke anymore. It moved like a person taking a breath. Daniel felt something inside him stir, a pull to speak. How can we help? He asked, his voice quiet but steady. The shadows trembled, as if reacting to his words. The air filled again with faint whispers, not the chaotic noise from before, but a softer, clearer tone. The darkness itself seemed to lean toward them, grateful and desperate all at once. For the first time since they entered, the fear that had held them both began to fade. The cemetery was still cold, still shrouded in night, but something had changed. Two living souls had done what hundreds before them never did. They stayed, they listened, and they cared. The faint light from Daniel's flashlight wavered across the tombs, landing on one shadow that began to move differently from the rest. It pulled away from the cluster, drifting toward them like a slow breath in the dark. The shape was faint, almost transparent, but as it came closer, its outline grew clearer, a woman, her hands covering her face, her body trembling with quiet sobs. The sound of her crying filled the air again, raw and hollow. Caroline felt her chest tighten. She took an unsteady step forward, her hand pressed to her heart. It's her, she whispered. She's the one we've been hearing. The shadow woman lifted her head slightly, though her face was still hidden by her hands. Her form rippled as though made of smoke caught in still air. She didn't move closer but slowly raised one trembling arm, pointing toward a cracked marble tomb nearby. Daniel followed her gesture, his beam landing on the inscription carved deep into the stone. Beaumont Family Crypt, 1853. The front slab was split down the middle, one half slightly ajar as if it had been disturbed long ago. Caroline moved toward it, drawn by something she couldn't explain. The closer she came, the colder the air grew. Faint whispers surrounded her, forming fragments of words she couldn't quite understand. Between the sounds and flashes of thought, she began to feel images pressing into her mind, flickers of memory that weren't her own. A crowded street. A church bell ringing. The smell of burning candles and fear. People running with cloths pressed to their faces. A woman clutching a baby, eyes wide with terror. Caroline stumbled, gasping as the vision faded. She pressed her palms against the cold marble, grounding herself in the present. Daniel's voice was cautious. "What did you see?" She turned to him, her voice trembling. It was the yellow fever epidemic. 1853. People were dying faster than they could be buried. She looked back at the tomb. She was one of them. The weeping grew louder for a moment, rising and falling like waves. Caroline's voice softened. They thought she was dead. Through more fragmented whispers, the story began to take shape. Caroline and Daniel didn't hear words so much as feel them. Memories pressed into the cold air. The woman had fallen ill during the outbreak. Fever, delirium, breath shallow to the point of stillness. Her family, overwhelmed by loss, believed she was gone. They held a rushed funeral, like so many others that summer, and sealed her in the family crypt. But she hadn't been gone. Caroline shuddered as the realization hit her. The whispers filled with desperate gasps, muffled pounding, the unbearable panic of someone waking in total darkness, trapped behind stone. Her stomach twisted. Oh God, she was still alive. Daniel's face went pale. He could hardly bring himself to speak. They sealed her in. Caroline nodded, tears welling in her eyes. They didn't know. Nobody knew. The shadow woman's form flickered violently, her grief surging through the space like a storm. The air pressed down around them, heavy with anguish too old for words. Caroline's tears spilled freely now, tracing down her cheeks. "She's been here all this time," she whispered. "Trapped." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tightening with empathy. "Over 150 years," he murmured. "And no one ever heard her." The whispering shifted again, the tone softer now, like wind through leaves. The shadow woman lowered her hand from her face. For a moment, her outline sharpened enough for them to glimpse her expression, a sorrow deeper than anything Caroline had ever seen. The spirit turned slightly, pointing to another tomb just beside the Beaumont crypt. Its surface was smaller, newer, though still marked by time. Daniel angled the light toward the inscription. The name was nearly erased, but part of it remained: Elise Beaumont, born 1851, died 1853. Caroline covered her mouth. Her daughter. Daniel looked between the two tombs, his voice barely audible. "They're side by side, but," he frowned, "they don't line up." Caroline stepped closer, kneeling beside the base of the larger crypt. She traced her fingers across the worn ground, noticing the difference in elevation. The family tomb slightly higher, the smaller one sunken just enough that their foundations never met. Her voice cracked as she spoke. They weren't buried together. It hit both of them at once. The mother, sealed alive in one tomb. The daughter, buried just feet away, separated by stone and time. Caroline's tears fell onto the marble. "She's been calling for her child all this time," she whispered. Daniel's chest ached. He had taught history his whole life, told stories of wars and plagues, but none of them had ever felt this close, this personal. He could feel the weight of the woman's grief pressing against his ribs. "No one should carry pain like that," he said quietly. The air stirred again. Around them, the other shadows began to shift, some small, some faint, like echoes of lives long forgotten. They hovered at the edges of the light, not threatening but watchful. It was as if they had been waiting for someone to finally listen, someone to bear witness. Caroline wiped her face, still kneeling between the two tombs. "She's not the only one," she said softly. "They're all here, waiting to be heard." The silence that followed felt sacred. The shadow woman stepped closer to the split tomb, her movement slower, gentler now. She no longer covered her face. Her eyes, empty yet filled with unbearable sadness, turned toward Caroline, then Daniel. The air vibrated faintly, a single whisper rising above the rest, carrying one clear word: help. Daniel's breath caught. "She wants peace," he said. Caroline nodded through her tears. "She just wants to be with her daughter." The realization settled deep within them. They hadn't stumbled into the cemetery by chance. Something greater had drawn them here. They were meant to find her, to understand what no one else had cared to see. More shadows began to gather, their forms faint outlines in the darkness. Some stood close together, others apart, all facing the same direction, as if sharing in the moment. 100 unspoken stories filled the night, the quiet weight of centuries pressing softly against the living. Caroline took Daniel's hand, her voice steady despite the tears. "We can help her," she said. "We have to." Daniel nodded slowly, his fear replaced by resolve. "Then we will." The shadow woman lowered her arm and took a small step back toward her tomb. For the first time, the air around her seemed to lighten. The cries faded into quiet, the whispers softening to near silence. All that remained was the stillness of the cemetery, heavy, ancient, and waiting. The night had stopped being about fear. It had become something else entirely, a connection across time, a moment where compassion bridged the space between the living and the lost. All around them, the other spirits lingered, their outlines faint and shimmering. Some faded completely, others stayed a while longer, watching in silence. It was as if the entire cemetery was holding its breath, hoping this single act of kindness might finally open the door to peace. Caroline and Daniel stood together, hand in hand, before the broken tombs, two strangers chosen to listen, standing in the place where love, even after death, refused to fade. Caroline stood silently between the two tombs, her breath visible in the cold air. The world had shrunk to the glow of their flashlight and the gentle hum of unseen whispers. The decision came not from reason but from something deeper, a quiet pull of empathy that overpowered fear. "We can't just leave her like this," Caroline said softly. Daniel hesitated, his mind screaming the same objections any rational person would have. It was impossible. Ridiculous, even. But as he looked at the cracked stone, he realized that doing nothing would feel worse. He gave a small nod. "Let's help her rest." They didn't have tools or plans, just the will to do something. Daniel found loose pieces of stone near the base of the tombs, fragments worn smooth by time. Caroline joined him, stacking them carefully, one by one, between the two crypts. It wasn't construction, it was offering. Each piece felt like a gesture of peace, a small act of love meant to bridge what time had broken. The shadows that had once felt heavy now seemed to draw back respectfully, as if giving space. Others began to gather at the edges of the light, faint outlines watching in stillness. What had felt like menace now felt protective, their presence guiding, almost gentle. Daniel's hands trembled as he lifted another stone. "You know," he said, voice low, "I almost didn't come on this trip." Caroline glanced at him. "Why?" "My mother had another health scare. Nothing serious, but it scared me. I thought staying home would be safer, more responsible." He paused, pressing the stone into place. "But she told me, don't stop living while you wait for life to end." I thought she meant retirement. He gave a short laugh. Now I think she meant this. Moments like this. Caroline smiled faintly. She sounds wise. She's tough. Lost my dad early, but she never let grief harden her. Caroline rested her hand on a stone, her voice quiet. I've spent most of my life playing it safe. Even my art. Always worried about doing something too strange or too emotional, like people would think I'd lost control. She exhaled shakily. But tonight, I don't care how it looks. It feels right. They worked side by side, breathing in rhythm. Every stone added weight to the bridge and meaning to the night. Daniel felt his earlier fear shifting into something else. Respect, maybe even faith. The cemetery, once oppressive, now pulsed with quiet energy. Caroline brushed the dirt from her hands. If we can do this, something this impossible, this human, what else are we capable of? Daniel's eyes softened. Maybe more than we think. The temperature rose slightly as they continued, a subtle warmth spreading through the space. The oppressive chill faded. Each breath no longer came with frost but with something like relief. The other spirits seemed to sense it too. Shapes once blurred now appeared steadier, their faces almost visible for fleeting moments. Children, old men, lovers, watching silently as two living souls tried to mend what history had broken. Caroline paused to stretch her back. Her fingers were numb, her knees raw from kneeling on stone. How many of them, she said softly, are like her? Stuck here, waiting for someone to notice. Too many, Daniel replied. Maybe that's what we're meant to do. Notice. Their movements slowed as exhaustion set in, but they didn't stop. The rhythm of stacking became almost meditative. Lift, place, breathe, remember. Caroline's mind wandered through her life, unfinished sketches, missed chances, the times she'd chosen safety over expression. Daniel, meanwhile, thought of his classroom, the students who had given up too easily because no one had shown them how to try again. In this strange hour, among the graves, they were learning together that courage didn't come from absence of fear, it came from choosing to act anyway. Daniel sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool night. When I was younger, he said, I thought courage meant jumping off cliffs, making big gestures. But this, he looked at the fragile bridge of stones, this feels like the real kind. Quiet, small, but it changes something. Caroline nodded. You're right. Maybe courage is doing what compassion asks of you, even when the world would call you crazy. They shared a tired laugh, the kind that comes from too much emotion held too long. The bond forming between them felt natural, born not of attraction but shared purpose. In silence, they kept building, guided by instinct more than reason. The light shifted, softer now, like dawn sneaking in before its time. The air itself seemed to pulse in rhythm with their effort. For a moment, Caroline thought she saw faces in the dark, not frightening, but hopeful. The shadows leaned toward them, not to harm but to bless. Her arms ached. Daniel's hands were scraped and raw. Yet the exhaustion didn't matter. There was something sacred in their work, something that connected life and death, past and present. When they finally paused, the bridge of stone stretched between the two tombs like a gentle offering. It wasn't perfect, but it carried meaning. Caroline placed her palm against the final stone, whispering softly, for her, and her child. Daniel placed his hand over hers. For everyone who never got to say goodbye. The warmth around them grew slightly stronger. A faint wind moved through the cemetery, carrying with it a low hum that felt like approval. The presence of the spirits grew thicker, but no longer oppressive, only reverent. Caroline's voice trembled. Do you feel that? Daniel nodded. They're here. Watching. The awareness filled the air, not fear, but connection. The line between their world and whatever lay beyond blurred for a moment. Caroline looked at Daniel, his face lit by the golden edge of his flashlight, and realized that this act, this impossible kindness, had transformed them both. She smiled through her tears. "I think they trust us." Daniel smiled back, weary and sincere. "Then let's finish it right." Together, they adjusted the final stones until the small bridge looked complete. As they stepped back to see their work, the shadows seemed to draw closer once more, not to frighten, but to protect. The oppressive silence of the cemetery had changed into something hushed and sacred. The night that had begun with fear now held something far greater: purpose, courage, compassion. Caroline looked up at the dark sky beyond the trees. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in the world. She felt part of it, every heartbeat, every ghost, every memory, connected. Daniel broke the silence with a quiet thought. "If we can bring peace to the dead," he said softly, "maybe there's hope for the living too." Caroline's smile was tired but full of light. "Hope is exactly what this is." The whispering faded to near silence, the air calm and still. Only the faint rustle of leaves and the sound of their breathing filled the space between tombs. They had built more than a bridge of stone, they had built understanding between worlds. And as they stood there in the stillness, they both knew, their lives would never be the same again. The first light of dawn slipped quietly into the cemetery, soft and uncertain, like it, too, was unsure whether it belonged in this place of the dead. Faint pinks and golds brushed across the sky, painting warmth over stone and marble. Caroline lifted her head, catching sight of the light spilling through the wrought iron gate that had kept them trapped all night. It looked impossibly distant, yet tender, like hope itself reaching in. Daniel adjusted the final stone, his hands shaking with fatigue. The small arch they'd built between the two tombs looked fragile, but it stood. He sat back on the cold ground, shoulders slumped. Caroline joined him, silent and trembling, both of them staring at what they'd created. They were dirty, scraped, exhausted, but something inside them felt clean for the first time in years. The air shifted, gentler now. From the shadows near the tomb, a figure began to emerge. It wasn't a blur this time. It was clear, defined. The woman's form shimmered faintly in the morning light, her dress flowing like smoke. She raised her head, and for the first time, they saw her face. Kind eyes. A soft mouth. The kind of beauty that speaks of endurance, not vanity. Caroline gasped, her voice cracking. "It's her." The spirit's gaze lingered on them, grateful and tender. Then she turned toward the neighboring tomb, the one belonging to her child. For a breathless moment, nothing happened. The cemetery was still, holding its breath. Then, from the crack between the marble slabs, a faint glow began to pulse. A smaller shape stepped through. The light formed into the outline of a little girl, no older than 6. She looked weightless, her curls flickering in the morning air like candlelight. When she saw her mother, she ran. Caroline's hand flew to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. Daniel swallowed hard, unable to speak. The two spirits met between the tombs, where the bridge of stone now stood, and as the child reached her mother, the air itself seemed to sigh in relief. They embraced, the woman kneeling, her translucent hands wrapping around the child's shoulders. The little girl's arms circled her mother's neck, and for the first time in over a century, the space between them was gone. The light around them brightened, filling every crevice of the old cemetery with warmth. It wasn't blinding, it was healing. Caroline felt it flood through her chest like sunlight through glass, washing away the lingering fear, the exhaustion, even the sting of old wounds she hadn't realized she carried. The woman lifted her face toward them, tears of light sliding down her cheeks. No words left her lips, but both Caroline and Daniel felt the message in their hearts. "Thank you." The gratitude came not as sound but as feeling, pure, undeniable, and immense. It wrapped around them like a gentle tide. Caroline sobbed openly now, not from sadness but from the sheer beauty of it. Daniel's own tears came quietly. He let them fall, unashamed. The two spirits began to fade. The little girl pressed her face to her mother's shoulder as their forms slowly turned translucent, the light dissolving into the rising sun. Within seconds, there was nothing left but warmth and stillness. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or cold, it was peaceful, like the world had been waiting centuries for this exact moment to breathe again. Caroline closed her eyes. "They're free." Daniel nodded, his voice raw. "Yeah. They're home." The wind that followed was soft, carrying the scent of magnolia and wet stone. The cemetery, once cold and haunted, now felt alive again. Caroline turned toward the gate, her heartbeat quickening. It stood slightly open, no longer locked, no longer resisting. She approached slowly and pushed it. The iron groaned, but this time it moved easily, as though it had been waiting for her touch. They stepped out into Prytania Street. The sun had risen fully now, spilling gold over the quiet garden district. The contrast hit them like a wave, normal life unfolding as though the night hadn't existed at all. A jogger passed with a dog, earbuds in. A woman carried a bag of fresh bayonets down the sidewalk. The world was awake, unaware of what had taken place just beyond that gate. Caroline looked down at her dirt-covered hands and laughed weakly. "We look like we've crawled through history." Daniel smiled, voice soft. "Maybe we did." They walked in silence, the adrenaline fading and fatigue setting in. The city smelled of chicory coffee and wet pavement. A few blocks away, they found an all-night cafe tucked near Magazine Street, the kind that never really closed. Inside, warm light and the clatter of cups replaced the chill of the graveyard. They sat across from each other at a small wooden table, their clothes dusted white from marble dust. The waitress didn't ask questions. She just poured coffee, set down 2 plates of powdered sugar bayonets, and left them alone. Neither spoke at first. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full, like they were both still listening for echoes of what they just lived through. Daniel stared into his coffee, the steam rising like a quiet offering. Caroline finally broke the silence. "Do you think anyone would believe it?" He looked up at her, his eyes tired but steady. "Maybe it's not about that. Maybe it's just meant for us." Caroline nodded, wiping her eyes with the corner of a napkin. "It feels too big to explain anyway. Like trying to describe love to someone who's never felt it." Daniel smiled faintly. "You're right. Some things can't be told. They can only be felt." Outside, the streetcars began to rumble awake, their bells faint in the distance. The world was moving forward again, but something within both of them had shifted forever. They weren't just two travelers who had shared a strange night. They were witnesses to something sacred, proof that compassion could reach across even death's divide. Caroline reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. He didn't move away. She whispered, "I don't think this was an accident." Daniel's hand turned, clasping hers gently. "No," he said. "I think we were supposed to be there." The cafe door opened behind them, and sunlight poured in, striking their table. Dust motes shimmered in the beam, floating between them like tiny blessings. Caroline smiled, closing her eyes for a second. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel afraid of what came next. She felt grateful, changed, alive. The morning after their night in Lafayette Cemetery stretched before them like a dream they weren't ready to wake from. Caroline and Daniel lingered in the cafe, their coffee cold but their silence warm. Outside, the sun bathed the city in gold, and the world went on, oblivious to the two people who had just spent a night with ghosts and come out changed. Caroline finally spoke, her voice quiet but certain. "I've spent most of my life being careful," she said. "I stayed in my comfort zone, never traveled far, never took chances. I told myself I liked stability, but really, I was just scared." Daniel nodded, listening. She looked down at her hands. "But last night, I felt something I haven't felt in years. Even though I was terrified, I felt alive. Like I was actually part of something bigger than myself." Daniel smiled faintly. "Funny. I almost didn't come on this trip." Her head lifted. "Really?" "Yeah," he said. "I kept telling myself I didn't have time. That I couldn't leave my students, that there were always papers to grade, lessons to plan. But if I'm honest, I think I was afraid of being alone with my thoughts." He paused, glancing out the window where the streetcar rumbled past. "My mom used to say that fear's just a teacher in disguise. I never understood that until last night." Caroline smiled softly. "She sounds wise." "She is," he said. "She'd love you." The words hung between them, unexpected and unguarded. Caroline didn't look away. The connection between them felt effortless, like they'd known each other longer than a single day. They decided to walk. The morning air was cool, and the oak trees along St. Charles Avenue stretched wide over the tracks, their branches laced with old Mardi Gras beads. The streetcars rattled by, full of tourists snapping photos. Daniel and Caroline moved at their own pace, talking about everything: their families, childhoods, the moments that had shaped them. Caroline laughed as she told him about her first art teacher, who said her drawings had too much emotion to ever sell. Daniel countered with a story about one of his students, a boy who hated reading until he discovered comic books about ancient civilizations. They ended up at a quiet cafe tucked off the main road, a place Daniel had read about in a travel guide. They sat outside under a wrought-iron balcony, splitting bayonets dusted in sugar, sipping coffee that tasted faintly of roasted chicory. Every time they laughed, the world seemed lighter. After breakfast, they took the streetcar north to City Park. The New Orleans Museum of Art stood white and calm against the sky, surrounded by giant oaks and statues draped in moss. Inside, they wandered slowly, stopping often. Caroline sketched a sculpture of a mother and child in her notebook, her fingers tracing invisible lines in the air. "You see stories in everything, don't you?" Daniel asked. She looked up. "I think I just look long enough to find them." He smiled. "That's a rare gift." They spent hours moving through the galleries, saying little but understanding much. Every painting, every shadow, every glimmer of light seemed more meaningful after what they'd witnessed in the cemetery. Fear had stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving only clarity and connection. The next 3 days passed like something out of another world. They stayed in touch constantly, their separate travel itineraries merging into one. On the second evening, they took a steamboat cruise along the Mississippi River. The air was warm, the water gold under the setting sun, and a jazz band played softly in the background. Caroline leaned on the railing, her hair catching the light, and Daniel found himself wondering how someone could feel both familiar and brand new all at once. On their third day, they took the ferry to Algiers Point, standing side by side as the sun dipped behind the skyline. The river breeze tousled their hair, carrying with it the smell of salt and earth. "It's strange," Caroline said quietly. "Before this trip, I felt stuck. I thought life was about staying safe. But now, I think safety isn't living. It's just existing." Daniel nodded, watching her. "Yeah. Fear doesn't go away. You just decide it's not in charge anymore." That night, they followed a jazz funeral procession through the Treem neighborhood. The streets pulsed with brass and drums, laughter and tears mingling as one. People danced behind the musicians, waving white handkerchiefs in the air. Life and death existed side by side, Neither winning, neither losing. Caroline felt her chest ache, not from sorrow, but from the beauty of it all. Daniel took her hand as the band reached its crescendo. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They both understood what drew them together. It wasn't chance. It was recognition. They'd seen the same truth. Courage wasn't loud or grand. It was quiet and human. It was the choice to care when it would be easier not to. Later, sitting outside a bar lit by string lights, Daniel told her about his students again. About the girl who challenged everything he taught, the one who asked hard questions about history and fairness. She reminds me why teaching matters, he said. Because the past isn't just old, it's alive in how we treat each other now. Caroline smiled. You're good at seeing what others miss. He chuckled. That's coming from the woman who literally heard a ghost. She grinned, then turned serious. I want to do more than just illustrate other people's stories. I want to write my own. For kids who feel unseen. For anyone who's afraid of the dark. Daniel's eyes softened. You should. You have something real to say. They spent their last evening in Jackson Square, right where it all began. The square buzzed with life, street performers, musicians, tourists, locals laughing near the iron benches. The St. Louis Cathedral glowed white against the indigo sky, bells echoing faintly over the Mississippi breeze. They stood together, watching the lights shimmer on the cobblestones. Neither wanted to speak first, afraid the words would break the fragile magic between them. Finally, Caroline turned to him. I don't want this to end. Daniel looked at her for a long moment before answering, his voice steady but full of feeling. Then let's not let it. Portland and Boston aren't that far apart. She smiled through the tears welling in her eyes. That's a long way for some people. He reached for her hand, holding it gently. Some things are worth the distance. They stood there as a saxophone played softly in the distance, its notes floating through the warm night air. Around them, life went on, tourists laughed, musicians played, the city pulsed with rhythm and memory. But for Caroline and Daniel, everything was still. The noise faded, the world narrowed to one quiet truth. They had found something worth keeping. Not just love, but courage, kindness, and the certainty that even in the darkest places, light could grow. 6 months passed, yet that night in Lafayette Cemetery never drifted far from Caroline's thoughts. It had changed everything, how she saw fear, how she saw love, and most of all, how she saw herself. When spring came, she packed her small apartment in Portland, loaded her car, and drove east until the skyline of Boston rose before her. It wasn't just a move. It was a decision made with courage born in a place of shadows and whispers, now guiding her into the light. Daniel was waiting at the edge of the city when she arrived, holding a cardboard sign that read "Welcome Home, Braveheart." She laughed, but tears filled her eyes as she stepped into his arms. Boston would be different. Yes, but it already felt right. Her first children's book contract came within weeks. The story was about a child who learns that fear loses its power when met with kindness. Every page shimmered with color and quiet bravery, every brushstroke drawn from what she'd lived through. On the dedication page, she wrote, "For those who choose compassion over fear." When she handed the finished manuscript to Daniel, he didn't say a word for a long time. He just smiled and pulled her close. "You finally wrote it," he said softly. She nodded. "It feels like I was meant to." Life in Boston unfolded gently. Daniel introduced her to his mother, a sharp-witted woman who adored Caroline from the first moment. "You've got soul, I can tell," she said over dinner one night, raising a glass of wine. "My son finally met his match." Caroline's laugh filled the kitchen, warm and real. She began volunteering at Daniel's school soon after, helping in the art room. What started as a few hours a week turned into a full creative program. Children who struggled in class found their voices through drawing and painting. One boy who barely spoke created a watercolor of a lighthouse shining through fog. Another girl filled her sketchbook with portraits of people smiling through tears. Daniel often watched from the doorway as Caroline guided them, never pushing, only inviting. She treated their feelings like stories worth telling, no matter how small or messy. Together, they carried forward the lesson the cemetery had given them. Listen to pain, even when it's quiet. Don't run from it, reach toward it. Inspired by their experience, Daniel launched a school project that quickly became something much bigger. He called it the Memory Garden. Students researched forgotten local cemeteries, restoring old gravestones, cleaning debris, and writing short biographies of the people buried there. The children treated every name like a chapter waiting to be remembered. Some graves belonged to immigrants, others to veterans, midwives, or unknown children. Each one found a voice again through their work. Caroline often joined the students on weekends, sketching as they cleaned, capturing moments of care and laughter. One afternoon, she watched two students kneeling by a grave covered in ivy. The younger one asked, "Do you think they can feel us helping?" The older replied, "Maybe not. But it still matters." That simple truth stuck with her. Her second book took shape soon after, a story about a lonely child befriending a ghost who couldn't rest until someone listened. It was fiction, but rooted in the heartbeat of truth. The story wasn't about fear at all, it was about empathy, and how love could reach across any divide. As the months passed, life became a quiet rhythm of teaching, painting, and growing together. But when October arrived again, both Caroline and Daniel knew they had unfinished business. On the one-year anniversary of that night, they flew back to New Orleans. They retraced every step, bayonets at the same cafe, jazz in the quarter, a slow walk through the garden district beneath those same whispering oaks. The city felt lighter now, no longer holding its breath. When they reached Lafayette Cemetery No. 1, they entered through the main gate, this time in daylight, with permission and purpose. The Beaumont tombs stood where they had before, weathered but dignified. Between them lay the stones they'd placed that night, now covered in soft moss. The bridge looked as though it had always belonged there. Caroline touched the cool marble and smiled faintly. "Do you think it really happened?" she asked. Daniel studied the tombs, the gentle light, the stillness that seemed to hum with peace. "Some things can't be explained," he said quietly. "Only felt." They placed fresh magnolias on both tombs. A warm breeze swept through the cemetery, carrying the faint scent of blossoms and something that felt like gratitude. Neither spoke for a long while. There was no need to. On the flight home, Caroline gazed out the window as clouds drifted beneath them. "You know," she said softly, "that night taught me something I'll never forget. Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about staying kind even when you are." Daniel nodded, his hand resting over hers. "Exactly. Fear makes walls. Kindness builds bridges." Over the months that followed, their lives became living proof of that lesson. Their relationship flourished, not because it was effortless, but because they met every challenge with honesty and care. They learned to listen to each other's silences as much as their words. At school, every child learned that fear was natural, but kindness was a choice. The art program expanded, the memory garden grew, and forgotten graves across the city found flowers again. Stories once buried in time now lived through the hearts of those who remembered. Caroline's books reached thousands of readers, each story a gentle invitation to face fear with love. Letters poured in from parents, teachers, and children who saw themselves in her pages. A little girl from Texas wrote, "Your book helped me sleep with the light off again." A boy from Chicago wrote, "I read it with my grandma and we both cried." Each message was another ripple of that one night, proof that compassion, once released, never truly ends. Every act of listening, every moment of staying instead of running, every hand reaching toward pain instead of away from it, all of it mattered. The cemetery had taught them that some shadows aren't meant to be feared, they're meant to be understood. Caroline often told her students, "We all carry darkness, fear, grief, loneliness, but we can choose what to do with it. We can hide, or we can turn it into light." Her voice would soften as she added, "Kindness isn't always easy. Sometimes it means staying when you'd rather leave. But that's how healing begins." Daniel would smile at her from across the classroom, knowing she was speaking from truth. Together, they lived by a simple creed: choose compassion over comfort. Every single time. In the end, their story wasn't about ghosts at all. It was about being human. About daring to care when fear said not to. About building bridges where others built walls. About the courage to listen, to love, to keep showing up even when it's hard. Because kindness is radical. Love is revolutionary. And courage, real courage, is what turns darkness into light. So if this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this. Tomorrow, we're bringing another story you won't want to miss. Your support, your likes, your comments, your subscriptions, helps us keep telling these stories that matter. Thank you for being part of this journey, for listening, for believing that compassion still has power. Together, we can keep the ripples going.